Their
George
partnership
Harrison was known around the world, leaving little room for anyone else. While John Lennon captivated
George
audiences
respected
with
their
his rebellious attitude.
He admired their
and Paul
work
McCartney
ethic.
became famous
But as his own
songwriting
songwriting
improved,
songs,
he became
George
increasingly
often stood in the
frustrated that his
background,
ideas
speaking
rarely
only when he
received the
truly
same
had
attention.
something to say.
Most Beatles
But
albums
beneath that
included
calm
only
personality
one or two
was
of
a
George's
man
songs,
fighting a
Sometimes he
silent
had written
battle.
several
For
strong
years,
compositions.
he struggled to
Yet they
earn
remained
recognition
unfinished
inside
or simply
the biggest
left
band
off the
in
record.
music history.
To George, his
It wasn't just
frustrations
about
grew
numbers.
quietly.
It was about
hidden
respect.
behind polite
He wanted his
smiles
fellow
and
bandmates to
unforgettable
recognize
guitar
that he had
solos.
grown into a
Although
songwriter
millions
capable of
admired
standing
him,
beside them.
George often felt
not
like his
behind them.
voice was the
At the
least
same
important
time,
inside the Beatles.
George was changing
How did one of the
personally.
greatest
His
musicians
fascination
of all
with
time
Indian
become the
culture
band's most
and
spirituality
overlooked member?
deepened?
And what
He
happened
studied
behind the
meditations
scenes
that left
explored
emotional
Eastern
scars
philosophy
long after Beatlemania
and became
faded.
captivated by
To
the
understand
sounds
that
of traditional
story,
Indian
we have to
instruments
return
like
to the beginning.
sitar and
George
tambura.
Harrison was born
These
on
influences
February
began
25th,
appearing in
1943
Beatles in Liverpool,
songs such as
England.
Love You Too,
He was the youngest
Within You
of
Without
four
You,
children in a
and
hard-working
the inner
family
light
that valued
introduced
honesty,
millions of Western
determination,
listeners
and
to
simple
musical
pleasures.
traditions they had
Money
never
was never
experienced
plentiful.
before.
But
George
George's
wasn't
parents
simply
created a
experimenting
loving
with
home
new
where
sounds.
music was always
He was
welcome.
expanding the boundaries
His mother,
of popular
Louise
music.
Harrison,
Yet despite
loved
his
singing
creative
around the
breakthroughs,
house.
he
Friends
often
and
felt
neighbors
isolated
often joked
inside
that her
his
powerful
own band.
voice could be
Paul
heard
McCartney,
throughout the street.
known for his perfectionism,
She encouraged George's curiosity
increasingly
from
took
an
charge
early
during
age,
recording sessions,
never discouraging
he had a
his
clear
growing
vision for
obsession with
nearly
music.
every song.
Long before
Every
he ever
guitar
touched a
part,
guitar,
every harmony,
George found himself
every
fascinated
by
Many musicians
unusual
admired
sounds.
Paul's
His
incredible
mother
attention
frequently
to
listened to
detail.
broadcasts
But for
featuring
George,
Indian music,
that same
exposing him to
perfectionism
instruments
sometimes
and
felt
melodies that were
overwhelming.
completely different
Instead
from
of
traditional
encouraging
British
collaboration,
music.
at the
George
time,
believed it left
nobody
little
could
room
have
for
imagined
anyone
that these
else's
early
creativity.
experiences would later
One
influence
recording
not
session
only George's
became
career,
a symbol of those
but also the
frustrations.
direction of modern
While
popular
working on
music.
Maxwell's
The Harrison
Silver
family
Hammer,
first
Paul
lived
spent
in a
countless
modest
hours
terraced
perfecting
home
every
without
small
many modern
detail.
comforts.
George
He
later
came from a
admitted
single
that he struggled to
coal-fired,
understand
and the
why
toilet
so
was
much
outside.
energy was devoted
Life
to
wasn't
a song.
luxurious.
He personally
but George
considered
rarely
lightweight
complained.
compared to other material
Instead,
the band.
he
could have been
developed a
recording.
quiet
He respected
imagination that would
Paul's
stay
talent,
with him for the rest
but
of
he
his
also
life.
felt that Paul's
When he was still a
determination
young
to
boy,
control every
the family
aspect
moved
of the
to a
sessions
council
often
house
came
in
at
the
the
Liverpool
expense
suburb
of
of
everyone
Speak.
else.
School
George
never
would later
truly
remark
excited
that Paul
George.
always seemed
Although he
eager to
attended
help
Liverpool
after everyone had
Institute
finished
High
recording
School,
Paul's own
he found the
songs.
classroom restrictive.
When it came time to work
What
on
interested him
George's
far more
material
was music.
However,
He
the
constantly
dynamic
doodled
often felt
guitars
different.
in his notebooks.
Those
instead of
experiences
paying
left
attention to
lasting
lessons.
scars.
Everything changed
Despite his
one day
quiet
in
personality,
1956.
George was
While
becoming
riding his
far
bicycle
more
through the
confident
neighborhood
in defending
George
his
heard
ideas.
Elvis Presley's
By the time the
Heartbreak
Beatles began
Hotel
recording
playing
Abbey
from a
Road,
nearby house,
something had changed.
The moment stopped him in
George
his
was no
tracks.
longer willing
From that
to
day
quietly
forward,
accept criticism.
rock and roll
His
became
songwriting
his
had
passion.
reached an entirely
He listened to
new
artists
level.
like Carl
He arrived
Perkins,
with two
Lonnie
remarkable
Donegan,
compositions,
Django Reinhardt,
Something,
George
and
Formby,
Here Comes
and
the
Cab
Sun.
Calloway,
Both songs
absorbing
would become
every sound he could
timeless
find.
classics.
At around 14
For the first
years
time,
old,
many
George
critics
finally
argued that
received
George's
his
work
first
stood
guitar
shoulder to
after his
shoulder
mother
with Lennon
bought
and
one from a
McCartney's
family
finest
friend.
material.
It wasn't an
Even
expensive
John Lennon
instrument.
praised
In
something.
fact, it was quite
While
basic.
Frank Sinatra
but
would
to
later
George,
describe it
it
as one of the
represented
greatest
an
entirely new
songs
future
ever written.
He practiced
Ironically,
constantly,
the recognition
often
until
George
his
had
fingers
waited
hurt.
years to receive
Friends taught him
arrived
simple
just
songs,
as the Beatles
and before
themselves
long,
were beginning to fall
he was
apart.
learning faster than
Years of
anyone
creative
expected.
disagreements.
Soon he
Personal
formed a small
differences
skiffle group
and
called
business
the
pressures
Rebels
with
had
his brother
slowly
Peter
damaged
and
the
a friend from
relationships
school.
between all
the
four
band
members.
never became
George
famous,
reached a
but
breaking
it gave
point
George
during the
something
difficult
far
Let It Be
more
sessions
valuable.
in early
Confidence.
1969.
Around
The
the
atmosphere
same time,
inside the studio
another
had
life-changing
become
event
increasingly
occurred.
uncomfortable.
During the daily bus
Arguments
ride to
became
school,
common.
George
Every
met
rehearsal
another
seemed to
guitar-loving
create
teenager
new frustrations.
named Paul McCartney.
Eventually, the two quickly
George
bonded
did something
over
that
music.
shocked everyone.
They spent
He
hours
walked out
learning chords
without
together,
warning,
discussing
he
new
announced that he was
songs
leaving the
and
band.
encouraging each other's
For a
progress.
moment, it appeared
Neither
the
of them
Beatles
realized
had
they were
truly
laying
come
the
to an end.
foundation for
Although
one of
George
history's
eventually
most
returned
influential
after
musical
discussions with the
partnerships.
others,
Paul
the
eventually
emotional damage had
introduced
already been
George
done.
to his friend
The chemistry
John Lennon.
that once made
John
the
had already
band
formed a skiffle
unstoppable
band
was
called
fading.
the Quarrymen.
Behind the
And
smiles Although
George
shown in public photographs were four musicians moving in different
He was only
directions.
15 years old.
George's
John
frustrations
believed he looked far
extended
too
beyond
young.
songwriting.
Still, Paul
he wanted
refused to
artistic
give up.
freedom.
He
wanted
arranged
his
another
ideas
audition
treated
on
with
a
the same
Liverpool bus,
seriousness
where George
as everyone
performed the
else's.
instrumental classic.
After years of
Raunchy.
waiting patiently,
This time,
he
his
no
impressive
longer felt
guitar
willing to
skills
compromise.
completely changed John's
In later
opinion.
interviews,
George
welcomed
openly
into the group.
admitted that he
It
often
was the beginning
preferred
of a
working with
journey that would
musicians
eventually
outside
transform
the Beatles.
popular music
He
forever.
once explained that
As the
while
group
Paul
evolved from
McCartney
the
was an
Corey and
outstanding
into the
bass
Beatles,
player,
George's
his musical
musical
style could
could
sometimes feel
Instead of
overpowering.
continuing his education,
George even
he left
suggested
school
that he would
and
happily
began
join
working
another
as an
band with
apprentice
John Lennon,
electrician,
but would
to help
hesitate
support
to do
do the same with Paul while pursuing music.
Not because of personal
hatred. It was a
hatred,
risky choice,
but because their creative
success
approaches
seemed
were so
incredibly
different.
unlikely.
Those comments
Thousands of
surprised
young
many
musicians
fans.
dreamed of becoming
For decades,
famous. The
and
public
very
had viewed the
few ever
Beatles
achieved
as
it.
a perfectly
But George
united
believed
group.
the gamble
In
was worth
reality,
taking.
their
In
relationships had
1960,
become
the
far
Beatles
more
traveled to
complicated.
Hamburg, Germany,
Even Paul later
where they
admitted that he
performed
may have
exhausting
underestimated
sets
George's
after night
songwriting
in crowded
ability
clubs.
during the band's
The demanding
early years.
schedule sharpened
He
their
acknowledged
skills
that George
and
had been a
forced them
late
to
bloomer,
become tighter musicians.
but once his confidence developed,
However,
he began
George's
writing some of the
first
greatest
trips ended
songs in rock
unexpectedly.
history. Because he was
Unfortunately,
still underage,
by the time that recognition
German authorities
arrived,
discovered
the emotional
he wasn't
distance
legally
between
allowed
them
to
had
perform
already
in
grown
nightclubs.
too large.
He was deported
George
back to
had spent
England.
years,
Although
feeling
embarrassing at the
overlooked.
time, years
The
watching his
setback
ideas
proved
pushed
temporary.
aside. Only a
Years
short time
waiting
later,
for others to
manager
believe
Brian
in his
Epstein
talent.
entered the picture
Eventually,
and
he
completely
stopped seeking
transformed
anyone's
the band's
approval.
future.
He simply
He
wrote
polished
the
their
music
image,
he wanted to
secured a
write.
recording
That
contract
quiet
with
confidence
EMI,
became
and
one of
helped
the
launch
defining
what would
qualities
soon
of his
become
later
Beatlemania.
career.
But the
Their
growing
debut
tension
single,
inside the
Love Me
Beatles
Do,
wasn't limited to
introduced them
George's
to the world.
relationship with Paul
Soon
McCartney.
after came Please
Another
Please Me,
friendship, followed
one
by an
that had
explosion
existed
of
since the
global
band's
success,
earliest
unlike
days,
anything popular
was also
music had
beginning
ever
to
witnessed.
fracture.
And in
Fans
many
screamed.
ways,
That
concert
conflict would
halls
leave an even
overflowed.
deeper
The
emotional
Beatles became
impact on
an
George
international
Harrison's life.
phenomenon almost overnight. Yet even as fame surrounded him, George Harrison remained remarkably reserved. The newspapers quickly gave him a nickname that would stay with him forever: the Quiet Beatle. To the public, he appeared calm, humble, and content. But behind that quiet smile, George Harrison was beginning to realize that becoming part of the world's biggest band came with a painful price, one that would slowly shape the rest of his career. By the mid-1960s, the Beatles had become the biggest band on the planet. Every new album broke records. Every concert attracted thousands of screaming fans. To the outside world, the four musicians looked inseparable.